lecturers of the Faculty of Arts and Design Education, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, and Professor Klaus from Martin Luther University. We would like to welcome all attendees to the Studium General with the theme of the development of ethnomusicology in Germany. Next, let's directly enter the core event, which is the presentation of the material by the keynote speakers, which also closed by a discussion, and there's also will be question and answer. The panel session will be guided directly by Mrs. Zakia Pawitan, MSN. So, please join us and welcome Mrs. Zakia Pawitan, MSN.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Sel. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Faculty of Arts and Design, University of Pendidikan Indonesia, Studium General today. I'm Zakia Pawitan as your moderator for this session. And I would also like to greet in Honorable Vice Dean of Academic Affairs, Dr. Trianti Nugraheni, and Professor Dr. Trianti Nugraheni, MSI, and then Mr. Saprudin, our distinguished guests and participants. Thank you for joining us today. And I will read the curriculum vitae in Indonesian language so they can understand well. Oh yeah, only you. Okay, he said Indonesian language understand by you all, but not by him. Okay, jadi this is Professor Klaus Neumann. Itu keahliannya adalah di habilitasi dan etnomusikologi, ya. Sering mengadakan kegiatan perkuliahan, penelitian lapangan, kegiatan pengajaran, dan juga perolehan dana penelitian dari pihak ketiga. Nah, pelatihan profesionalnya itu di bidang etnomusikologi dan Kepala Departemen Etnomusikologi di IMMS Universitas Martin Luther Hall Wittenberg. Juga membimbing tesis akhir ya, baik dari sarjana, master hingga disertasi. Jadi mengajar di S1, S2 dan S3. Lalu ada juga perpanjangan kontrak 1 tahun sebagai pegawai negeri sipil ya di Jerman. Itu di Venia Legendi untuk bidang etnomusikologi di Fakultas Ilmu Pengetahuan Manusia Universitas Köln. Ya. Lalu pernah juga menjadi wakil presiden Komite Nasional ICTM International Council for Traditional Music di Jerman. Dan selanjutnya beliau juga telah menjadi profesor di Institut Ethnomusikologi Eropa di Universitas Köln, mengadakan ujian masuk, ujian menengah, dan ujian akhir di Universitas Köln sejak 2011, jadi sudah berkiprahnya. Dan sebagai ada 10 publikasi terpenting yang sudah dilaksanakan oleh Profesor Klaus. Di antaranya itu penelitian-penelitian dalam musik teknologi dan juga musik-musik tradisional Jerman, dan pendekatannya itu semuanya pendekatan budaya atau etnomusikologi dan habilitasi. Dan juga ada juga dia peneliti di Istana Raja-Raja Rock Progresif, juga pernah meneliti. Lalu pentingnya John Schaeffer bagi etnomusikologi Eropa. Lalu ada yang ini saya nggak bisa baca, nggak tahu bahasa apa ya, tapi yang bisa saya baca itu masih tentang etnomusikologi, jadi selalu fokus di situ. Nah, so for today we going to listen to Professor Klaus Neumann for the next 1 hour together. He will be presenting the presentations for 40 minutes, and then maybe we have another 15 minutes for a discussions. You may prepare your answer to your questions too. And so please welcome the distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. Klaus Naumann.
So, selamat pagi. No, selamat siang. As you see, my shirt is totally Javanese. My language is not. So, unfortunately, it's embarrassing. Last year, I had a course in Bahasa Indonesia, but unfortunately, I forgot 50%, and the other 50% I totally mix up. So it might happen that I say instead of selamat siang, selamat sayang. And you would not do that on the street, so I have to be very careful what I say. So the lecture today is on the development of ethnomusicology in Germany within the context of ideological currents. The idea is from one of my colleagues here in Bandung. I think it was Professor Juju who mentioned that. That would be really interesting for the students to talk a little bit about, what is ethnomusicology in Germany like. And I thought this is a very, very good idea to do that. So I prepared that lecture and I hope it will not be too boring for you. Anyhow, in the beginning, I would really like to thank my colleagues who did that so wonderful, who organized that so wonderful, and that is Professor Trianti, and that is Professor Juju, and that is also Dr. Rita, and Mrs. Sakia, and Mrs. Selfie, and Mr. B, as far as I know. Thank you so much for organizing that, so wonderful, and it's really great. So, what can we say about the development of German ethnomusicology? It can be said that ethnomusicology, including German ethnomusicology, established as an independent discipline, or as you will, as a subdiscipline of musicology at the end of the 19th century, when it still was called comparative musicology. The starting point goes back further, namely at least to the beginning of the New Age and the related colonization with all those cruelties that we know so well. So that means that the starting points for ethnomusicology were mainly at the 15th century onwards, when people met other people with totally different cultures, including musical expressions. There was a clash of cultures, I would call it. However, to go into such a long period of time would go beyond the scope of this paper. Therefore, I will focus exclusively on the development of German ethnomusicology, including, of course, ethnomusicology in general as well. It can be stated that today there is a broad consensus among experts that at least two groundbreaking technological inventions and scientific findings in the late 19th century led directly to the emergence of ethnomusicology, or, as it was called during these days primarily, was called comparative musicology. These were first and foremost the invention of the phonograph by Thomas Alva Edison in 1877, which made it possible for the first time to preserve sound, which was a groundbreaking innovation for musicological research. This in turn led to the first phonogram collections and archives in Vienna, namely the Vienna Phonogram Archive and the Berlin Phonogram Archive. And as you see, something changed. People were going more and more in the field and were using this phonograph to do recordings there. The second important invention was the introduction of the logarithm-based cent unit by Alexander John Ellis in 1875. Instead of using long and unclear Hertz numbers, Ellis divided the octave into 1,200 cents and each tempered semitone into 100 cents. This made it for the first time possible to compare easily musical scales from different musical cultures with one and another. And this is also where the term comparative musicology takes on a deeper meaning. In detail, Ellis did this in his essay on the musical scales of various nations from 1885. And here you can see that very nicely. On the one hand, you have here these very complicated Hertz numbers, and on the other hand, the cents, which are so easy, from one half step to the next, it is 100 cent, going to the next 100 cent, whereas these numbers, they don't really tell so much about the structure. So, and this can also be seen in the paper he wrote about this new unit, which is the cents. You can see in the beginning, introduction as always, then he talks about musical scales in general, and then you can also see the cents, he's talking about cents, and then he's starting to really to show how the scales of different nations work. That is, for example, Persia, Arabia, Singapore, India, and here, Java. Java too. So this can also be seen more in detail here. In the paper he talks about different cultures, musical cultures, and the scales that they are using. And here you see it wonderfully how from one tone to the next, it's 204 cent, to the next one it's 182, then 112, and so on and so on. And you still see that the octave plays a very important role. So that was for the first time possible to compare different scales from different nations in an easy way, I would say. Last thing, I would not go too much into detail. What he also was able to do to show all the physical phenomena in the world of tones, for example, the comma of Pythagoras, I think it's here. You can see that you can precisely say it's 24 cent, and that was before that not possible in such an easy way. You see here these numbers, they're very, very complicated, and you cannot really figure out what they mean. So, after these developments, it is not surprising that at some point of history, which was the end of the 19th century, it was noticed that there are scientists who deal with the music of other cultures. For example, the founder of musicology in Vienna, was Guido Adler, wrote in his important essay, Scope, Method, and Aim of Musicology from 1885, he divided musicology in a historical and in a systematical branch. And as a part of the systematical branch, he lists musicology and also comparative musicology, basically meaning the same thing. This, you find it here. And he writes, a new and very rewarding secondary field in this systematic part is musicology, which is comparative musicology, which sets itself the task of comparing the sound products, in particular the folk songs of different peoples, countries, and territories for ethnographic purposes, and grouping and classifying them according to their different characteristics. So one can conclude that the two mentioned inventions, the Edison phonograph the one hand and the cent unit on the other hand, even more encouraged people in various countries, not only in Europe, although particularly in Europe, to become increasingly interested in the music of other cultures, and they were beginning to explore it more and more. In Hungary, there was Béla Bartók and Zoltán Kodály. In Romania, it was Konstantin Brelu, and in Czechoslovakia, it was Leos Janáček. In Western Europe, too, there were certain researchers at certain institutions who, in contrast to Eastern Europe, tended to focus on non-European music. There were, in Holland, particularly Jaap Kunst, who also coined the term ethnomusicology in 1950, and who became, of course, so well known for his research about music in Indonesia, especially here in Java, you say, sorry. In France, it was Julien Tirsault, who, like Kunst, also worked on Java, and furthermore, Rodolphe Derlanger, who dealt with Arabic music, and André Schäffner, specializing on music in Africa. And we have in Great Britain, very early on, 2 British soldiers, officers in the army, as far as I know that, with the names of N. Augustus Willett and Charles Russell Day, who wrote 2 incredible, impressive studies on music in India. A little later, it was Arthur Fox Strangways, who again worked on music in India, Hindustani music, and the Irish music historian Henry George Farmer, who was doing research on Arabic music. So, also in the USA, we had, for example, Francis Densmore, who had been conducting research among North American indigenous people and their music since 1907, as well as John Comfort Fillmore that we see here, who also specialized, that the Americans always did, that they were doing research a lot on the Indians and the indigenous people of the Americas. And the same can be said about this person, the anthropologist Alice Cunningham Fletcher, and another really important ethnomusicologist in the early days, that is here Helen Roberts, who did research about the music in Hawaii, and who also proved that from the very beginning the Americans were doing this somehow differently, because they were strongly influenced by Franz Boas, who is the father of anthropology and who was also German and who had a Jewish background as well, and who advocated cultural relativism. And there were many other, even earlier, individual examples of scholars who were conducting research about certain musical phenomena of non-European music. However, these were generally not real schools, but rather scattered individual cases. Since the last quarter of the 19th century, however, German comparative musicology has generally been the most influential school. The centers of comparative musicology were Berlin and Vienna. Almost all of their most important representatives were of European Jewish culture. And I say that on purpose, Jewish culture, because they were not really religious in that sense, and they did not really so much close to the Jewish religion and culture, but they defined themselves at first as scholars and articulated them also in that way. So the most important figures were the psychologist Karl Stumpf, who was the founding father of the comparative school in Berlin. It was the medical doctor and psychologist Otto Abraham. I've never seen a picture of him, unfortunately. And the probably most important figure of the comparative school in Berlin was Erich Moritz von Hombostel. So Hombostel was actually a chemist who had completed his doctorate on aldehyde components. And however, he came from a very musical family in Vienna and had been musical trained since his childhood. Another one was Kurt Sachs. He was the only, I would say, real musicologist by profession, and he was also an art historian who had also enjoyed musical training since his early childhood. The other persons were, of course, also important, but not so important as the few persons I just mentioned. There was Robert Lachmann. He was musicologist and orientalist. Mieczysław Koliński, middle you see him, who was composer, pianist, and music teacher, and also comparative musicologist. Abraham Zvi Edelson, another one who was anthropologist on Jewish culture, as well as musicologist and composer. And the only one that really did not have that Jewish background was Georg Schünemann. You see him here in the middle, doing together with Karl Stumpf research about Russian soldiers who were in camps. So there is also a branch in Vienna of the comparative musicology, but it's not so strong. Therefore, I will not go here in detail. I just mentioned the two names, and all the Austrians who might watch me now will forgive me for stating that they were not so important as the Berlin School of Comparative Musicology. There was Richard Walaschek and Robert Lach. Nevertheless, as I hope it became clear, the representatives of the Berlin comparative musicology movement came from very different disciplines. As I outlined, Stumpf was a psychologist, Abraham was a medical doctor, Kurt Sachs had studied art history and musicology. The most important representative, Erich Moritz von Hombostel, had studied chemistry before and has done his PhD there as well. So that means that these scientists had very different scientific backgrounds and worked in a highly interdisciplinary manner. It is obvious that one particular discipline over and above musicology was of particular importance, and that was, of course, anthropology, or as you call it sometimes, ethnology. During that times, and during the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there were two different directions of anthropology. This was on the one hand evolutionism, and as kind of a reaction to evolutionism, on the other hand, so-called diffusionism. So representatives of the evolutionist school of thought included Lewis Henry Morgan, Edward Burnett Tyler, James Frazer, Herbert Spencer, and the basic idea of evolutionism was that humans or people have developed in stages from lower levels to higher levels, or in other words, from simple to the complex and advanced. You can see that very often these kind of, paintings about that thing. And so they assumed that these stages of development were the same for all societies. Of course, this assumption is very crazy from a modern point of view, including that the evolutionists regarded Western European high cultures as the flower and the bloom of humankind. The lower stages of development were represented by the so-called primitive people, they called them like that, and other people, in between high culture, European high culture, and primitive people, as they call it, were non-European advanced civilizations or rural peasant classes or the working class in cities in Europe and elsewhere. So this means that hierarchies were established by comparing different cultures, higher or lower levels, and that the lower levels were interpreted completely speculatively as preforms of the higher levels. From the observation of current phenomenon of so-called lower levels of music of primitive cultures, as they called them, conclusions were drawn about past phases of human development. So it was also assumed that people develop similar cultural phenomena or inventions even without having direct contact. These were the ideas, and the problems with this, I would call it a very strange way of thinking, is, they are of course obvious. First of all, it is of course very arrogant, and secondly, it is an axiom to regard the own culture as the highest level of development and the others as lower ones. In other words, evolutionism was a classic case of Eurocentrism and of racism. The second stream of anthropology at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was diffusionism, which was representatives of Friedrich Ratzel, and there were Leo Frobenius, and there were other guys, especially from Vienna, who were called Bernhard Ankermann, Fritz Grebner, and Father Wilhelm Schmidt. So this diffusionism developed at the end of the 19th century as a reaction to evolutionism and was an important theory in social and cultural anthropology until the 1920s. Because the school had many German-speaking scientists, especially from Vienna, it was referred to as the German school. So the basic idea of diffusionism and the associated cultural theory were that cultures always influenced each other. And they also had the idea that there was a primary culture that originated, they were not so 100% sure about, at the 4th millennium before Christ, in the area between Nile and Indus, perhaps even in Atlantis. And they also thought that from this first culture, certain people were going in different ways in all directions. And so some of the diffusionists even believed in that this first culture, this prehistoric culture, was monotheistic, was monogamous, and was patriarchal. They did not know it, but they just assumed that. So an example of this way of thinking was this man, Wilhelm Schmidt, and he was a priest in Vienna who specialized in linguistics and anthropology, was very interested in Southeast Asia and Oceania, in Australia, and he was also interested in music-related topics. And you can see that, by the way, by the title here of the book that I put on the right side, der Ursprung der Gottesidee, so the origin of the idea of God. And what else did these diffusionists think? They thought that cultural innovation has always been very rare and therefore were attributed to a few creative people. So one can state that this theory also made a difference between genius and less genius, and it was, at least to some degree, also, one has to say it like it is, racist, implying always the question, where does our European genius actually come from? Above that, the methodology of diffusionism based in some respects completely on assumptions. So based on the spatial distributions of artifacts, attempts were made to draw conclusions about the relationships and migrations of prehistoric culture, and thereby attempts were made to explain the history of mankind and civilization in general. One tried to recapitulate the expansion processes and the migration of the early culture. So you very often find terms as original culture, primary culture, secondary culture, whereby, always the original culture was always regarded as the most meaningful. So, what does this now mean for comparative musicology in the Berlin School? To which theory did they belong to? Evolutionism or diffusionism? One can say that many comparative musicologists included ideas from both, from the one hand of evolutionism and on the other hand from diffusionism. And a good example of this is an essay by Karl Stumpf, the founder of comparative musicology, who wrote in 1885 in a paper which is called Songs of the Bellacula Indians. It's a very famous paper for ethnomusicology. And it clearly shows how evolutionist and diffusionist theories are mentioned almost in the same breath. So Karl Stumpf writes that the study of the melodies of less cultivated people can provide valuable clues to the music historical research has always been recognized by the representatives of the later. Besides the musical theoretical significance, these studies will, incidentally, in time gain an anthropological one, providing new markers of kinship, of early intercourse of separate tribes. You see, the first half is rather evolutionist idea, and the second half goes more into this direction of diffusionism. So in course of time, however, diffusionism, including the theory of cultural circles, as we call them, Kulturkreislehre, became more and more important for the Berlin School of comparative musicology. Especially Erich Moritz von Hornbostel, that is probably the most important representative of the Berlin School, he had some theories, the so-called Blasquinten theory and the theory of the Maßnorm, both of which were later proved as completely wrong. So just to give you a very short idea about what that is, in the theory of the Maßnorm, Hornbostel compared the length of flutes in musical instruments museums from different musical cultures and concluded that the same length of flutes must also mean they're somehow related. And it is obvious that this was highly hypothetical and also problematic. Furthermore, such assumptions greatly exaggerates the possibilities of research about music. This is also due to the fact that these guys from the Berlin School of Comparative Musicology, they hardly ever did conduct field research, a fact for which they were later accused and labeled as armchair anthropologists. Because, they were sitting just in the armchair and making the theories without having been into the culture itself. On the other hand, there's some really good things that they also did, and one of these things is, the systematics of the instruments, of musical instruments, that was done by Hornbostel Sachs in 1914, and I think all the musicologists or music pedagogues, they know that kind of systematization, and that was very well done, and one cannot say too bad things about that. And there were other things that they did. They were very interested in transcribing music, listening to music and transcribing it. They were also very interested in collecting music on wax cylinders, and they really did something well, even though the theories that they were kind of, the base for them was really problematic. Evolutionism and diffusionism both. So that was the end of the Berlin School of Comparative Musicology, and that was exactly when in 1933 in Germany and in Austria as well, a little later, the Nazis came into power. So that means that Stumpf and Abraham, they had already passed away, and Hornbostel fled to England via Switzerland, Sachs as Kolinsky, they went to USA, Lachmann went to Palestine, and Edelson had already done that before. So they were going in different directions, or they already died. So the people remained in Germany, in comparative musicology, were guys like Schünemann, I mentioned that name before. He did not do anything more anymore because he did not want to have to do so much with this Nazi ideology. But there were other guys like Werner Danker, that just mentioned the name, who were real Nazis. And also this strange person, Marius Schneider, who became later a professor in Cologne, he also had very strange ideas, and it was even too obscure for the Nazis, but also a very problematic figure. So one can say that since the Nazis came into power, there was no real comparative musicology in Berlin anymore. So let me talk a little bit, how much time do we have? Can I talk a little bit about the time after 1945? All right. So after Second World War, you probably know all that. The world was completely destroyed, and that was, mainly caused by Nazi Germany. And furthermore, Germany was divided into a western part and an eastern part. So on the one hand, we had the German Democratic Republic, which was the communism part as part of the Warsaw Pact. And on the other hand, we had the Federal Republic of Germany, which was part of the NATO and the so-called West. So this also had considerable impact on the way of research people could do in the eastern part and in the western part. So just giving you an idea about what happened in the eastern part of Germany, the communism part that was, associated to the USSR. That was really hard to do good research because there were several ideological restrictions. And of course, this had the smallest impact when topics were did not have so much to do with politics. And one example of that is him, Jürgen Elsner, who was a professor in ethnomusicology at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And his main field was Arabic music, so far away, there was not so much ideology in there. And in particular, he dealt with the theory of the maqam, along with stringed instrument and abjad, and an Algerian genre which is called ajaib. And he was also the teacher of a very important ethnomusicologist from the eastern part of Germany, Gisa Jenichen, who did a lot about Southern Asia, and Angelika Jung was working about Uzbekistan. So that was mostly the problem, that these people had to work in regions that were, as well as East Germany, somehow communistic, and other things were really hard to do. Nevertheless, there's some activities by the eastern part of Germany colleagues that were really impressive. So, for example, they edited a very interesting series, which is called Musikgeschichte in Bildern. That means music history in images. And they were able to really get very important people in the field of ethnomusicology, like, for example, Gerd Kubik. There was an Austrian expert, still lives, for music in Africa, as well as Henry George Farmer. I mentioned that guy before, who was expert for Islamic music, mainly in Arabic countries, as well as Alain Danielou, who was an expert of Indian music. So they were also quite active in networks like the ICTM, and they were doing conferences, and they even hosted a world conference in East Berlin, which was the capital of the German Democratic Republic. But when in 1989, how do we say, the Iron Curtain collapsed, and Germany was united again, many of these academics were dismissed. And the problem was very often that some of them who were at a high status and who did a habilitation, which is like a second doctorate in Germany and other countries, they had some contact usually with the, how do you say, the Stasi, that is the something like the CIA in the USA, but I would say, bad like that. And so that was a problem for them, and most of the carries just ended there. A few words about Federal Republic of Germany. There were some important figures. I will not go too much into detail, but this man is very important, called Reinhard. He was kind of the founding fathers of ethnomusicology after World War II, and he did a lot about Turkey, and together with his wife. And he was also professor in Berlin for the one and only Institute for Ethnomusicology. Another important figure was him, Josef Kuckertz. He first studied in Cologne, and he did a thesis, a PhD on Bartók, and then he became very interested in classical Indian music and did a habilitation in 1967, and he became professor of ethnomusicology first in Cologne and then later in Berlin. And he was very interested again in, there was kind of always the German way of doing ethnomusicology, having, transcribing a lot, and like to do analysis and find it out how you get it on paper, the music that you hear. And Josef Kuckertz was an important teacher for the younger generations of ethnomusicologists in Western Germany. And as we see here, that is, this here, Gerd Matthias Wegner. He founded a university in Kathmandu in Nepal, and he was a specialist for Indian music. Ulrich Wegner, he was a specialist for Arabic music as well. African music, that was my predecessor in Halle, and she did a lot of research about Thailand and about Vietnam, and she speaks very good Thai as well. He's from Hanover. He was an expert in African music. That was my doctor mother, Regina Alger Kaufmann. She did a lot about Brazil. And this is Gerd Rupe. He did a lot about African music and also about gamelan music. He made a virtual gamelan instrument. You can find that in the internet. It might be really interesting for you as well. However, the most important, I would say, ethnomusicologist in German-speaking countries is Max Peter Baumann, and you can find his writings also in the internet. It's really brilliant, and you can learn a lot from this person. His specialties were theory and methods of ethnomusicology in particular ethnomusicological field research. He did a lot about the age of globalization and the cultural anthropology of listening. So what can we say? These younger German ethnomusicologists, who are now already old too, they were strongly influenced by the American school of ethnomusicology. However, as I said before, fieldwork was really important for them, and music and culture, but transcription and analysis, I think they did much more than their American colleagues. So I'm coming to an end. Just as the history and the development of comparative musicology and ethnomusicology differed, for example, in the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, each country, also Indonesia, France, England, each has its specific development and its own historical development of what you call sometimes ethnomusicology or comparative musicology. It's very, very different. And I have to add that I left something completely out here, which is folk music and doing research about folk music, since for decades that was somehow separated. There was on the one hand comparative musicology dealing with the music of non-European people, and on the other hand, folk music, which was always dealing with music apart from art music, folk songs, folk dances, folk music in general. And they were really separated, but nowadays you can really say that this does not work anymore because, you know, the world is too complicated and there is a lot of migration. There is the influences of popular music. There's the influences of media, which makes it really, no, it doesn't make sense anymore to make a clear distinction between folk music on the one hand and ethnomusicology on the other hand. Final comment. As I have tried to explain, German comparative musicology and ethnomusicology has often been influenced by ideology. And I mean this really in a negative sense. This applies for the Berlin School of Comparative Musicology during the period of evolutionism and diffusionism, and especially to the period of National Socialism, which was the worst of all, and as well to the time of the German Democratic Republic. And according to my impression, it was the least ideological in the old Federal Republic of Germany. There was really, I think, if you read these works, there was not such a strong ideological influence. Okay, at one person a little bit more and others less, but in general, much less than before and in the other part of Germany. Today, various ethnomusicologists of the younger generation believe they are non-ideological. However, I don't think this is the case for all, as some of them are now heavily influenced by certain trends in cultural studies and post-colonialism theories. Of course, every ethnomusicologist today is, at least as I can see that, of course, against colonialism. That is, you know, everybody would say that. But the problem is that some trends in cultural studies and post-colonialism are strongly ideology and by far left-wing politics, or one can even go a little bit further by communism. And this can be seen, for example, in the fact that musical transcription is by some of these people nowadays dismissed as hegemonic practice, or that it is believed by some at least that only black academics have the right to do research on black music. I don't think that is true. I think everybody can make research about anybody, and we don't make a difference between colors, black or white, or, you know, religion. That should not be the point, to my opinion. And the fact that science is always somehow political, of course, is unavoidable. Science is always, to some degree, political. However, when science is ideologically indoctrinated, it becomes problematic. And nonetheless, that would go a little too far to go too deep in this today. Therefore, I would like to thank you for your attention and patience, since I covered a lot of ground very quickly here. And I'm looking forward to an exciting discussion and question.
Thank you very much. Okay, before I ask the audience, are they have any questions? Actually, I have one or two questions for you first. May I?
Of course.
Yes. You mentioned about real musicologists by professions. What does it mean? Yeah.
Okay. I mentioned that in one case, which was Kurt Sachs, because he was the only person in this comparative school of musicology in Berlin who studied musicology. The others, as I said, they were coming from totally different fields, Karl Stumpf was psychologist. The other one was a doctor of medicine. Then we had, from all different branches, the chemistry, Erich Moritz von Hornbostel. And still one can say that all of these guys they had such a broad background. They were always dealing with music, and they found it as logical and totally okay. I'm a psychologist, but why should I not deal with music? And they really could, they had all the tools to do that. They could transcribe, they could hear very well. So there was not a problem. I just said that because he was the only one who really studied musicology.
So academically background, yeah, that he has. Okay, the second question is that possible for us to conduct the research virtually, as we know that we have a new media that spread out, and the trend is also in the new media, even though they have no ideology as strong as the traditional music maybe, but the contemporary music that spread out in the new media maybe also has the new ideology itself. So is it possible for us to conduct the research virtually?
Not so long ago, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, when Corona was, I hold a seminar about ethnomusicology or ethnomusicological research and the internet. And we were thinking about, is it possible to do research without being there as a person physically? And as it became clear, for some musics, it does totally make sense that you do not choose the classical way of doing research, because some musics, they happen completely in the internet, and there's so much going on there. And we also had some really good examples from ethnomusicologists who are, I would say, real ethnomusicologists. They usually go to the field and they're doing interviews and doing, participant observation. But even those guys said for some things, in one case, it made totally sense to do it completely virtually. There was a work about it's a little bit an older work in the beginning of the internet already. It was really amazing to me, and he did that. Lislov, that was his name. He did research about composers who were composing, and they were exchanging ideas in the internet, and that was really interesting. And there are a lot of other ethnomusicologists who today, of course, say the internet and the virtual aspect is something that did not exist in these older days, but it is definitely. For example, if I go and do field research, I have a mobile, of course, with me, and I have WhatsApp, and I contact my informants, very often by WhatsApp, and they answer me. Sometimes we send files this way, sometimes we go over the internet. If in general, if ethnomusicologists prepare for fieldwork, they go in the internet, they just check what is on YouTube, what can we find, what writings can we find in the internet. So the internet is a very important part now. Completely virtual, I would say, depends on the topic, and most topics will, it would be better if you do the real fieldwork too.
Okay, I will invite questions from the audience. Ada yang mau bertanya?
My name Abizar. I'm from Bandung. I have one question. Searching for music archives in Indonesia, especially Sundanese music, is still considered difficult because awareness of documentation is still weak. How are music archive managed in Germany?
How are musical archives, excuse me?
What he means that how German maintain the archival of the history of the ancients and the traditional music history, uh, because compared to Indonesian, there are no archival systems to keep the history written or placed. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting question. Honestly, I've never been working in an archive, but of course, as an ethnomusicologist, you have to do with archives always because you need to hear the older recordings if you go to a certain region, and what you can find is that the old recordings that were made, they are now digitalized, and what I find also very problematic, and a good colleague of mine, he's dealing with that topic very often. He does research about indigenous music in Venezuela, of indigenous tribes, and they sometimes their music was recorded by anthropologists from Western countries, and they just took that music, as they called it, music, away. And later it turned out that what they partly recorded were, of course, in a Western point of view, songs, but in an indigenous point of view, there were certain singing to animals, to people who were dead. They were very private, and so it is a problem that this was was recorded, and now it is in Western archives, and they really have a problem how to deal with these recordings that are so personal and are sometimes even problematic. The whole archive topic is a very interesting one, and you say in Java in Indonesia you don't have so many archives. You should really look what they have in archives in Europe, and I think there should be an exchange between Indonesia and those archives in the so-called West who did a lot of research. As I pointed out, there was Kunst, there was Mantelhood, and there was also Gerd Ruppe, and there were so many others who did research, recordings. I think you should get into contact with them and ask them, well, it would be fair to share these recordings which came from your country. This is my spontaneous idea about that.
You get the message clearly? Okay. Is there any questions? More question, please? Yeah, boleh.
So, hello, my name is Arifah, and I'm from DKV. I'm not into music, but this is my first time actually listening to a professional about ethnic music. But there's a question that I saw about generalizing ethnic music. What do you say about people like generalizing, simplifying ethnic music in the modern times?
What do you think about ethnic music and the modern science? Did I get that right?
Can you repeat your...
What do you think about ethnic music in the modern science? Did I get...
In the first slides, you mentioned about the inventions of different part of the world about the traditional musics, and then it comes to the music scales. Yeah, so it become more one theory, and how you do it for the music, contemporary music, yeah, modern days.
Oh, that works. That works still. I think that this scent unit is really a good tool. And for example, I think we have a lot of guitar players here, and some of them they use a tuning machine. And the first thing that they learn without ever having heard about that is scent. So it's used today. And of course, there is one critical thing about this scent unit, because what it does, I have to go back to that. point, then I can explain it. It's also a Eurocentric theory and a Eurocentric unit, because if you look here, we have, on the one hand, we have the equal fourth with 500 cent, and we have, as it is here called, the just fourth with 498 cent. So the thing is, it looks like the equal fourth with 500 cent, that is a real thing. That is a good thing, because it's, it's a good number, it's 500. But actually, the real fourth that comes out of the overtones from the sound is 498. And the same is true for the fifth. You have the equal fifth with 700, and you have the just fifth. Again, it looks like the equal fifth is the real thing, the good thing, the right thing, and 702 is a little bit too high, but it's not. 702 is the real fifth. So that is, maybe that goes a little bit into your direction. What do you think about this cent unit? Does it work? And if you had that in mind, you are right. It is really Eurocentric, because it just assumes that the right way is 500 and not 498. But still, I think it is a good tool to compare different scales. I think for that reason, it's okay.
Jadi maksudnya bukan digeneralisasi, tapi itu hanya sebagai alat ukur sejauh mana sih level musikalitasnya gitu, nadanya di mana gitu biar pas. Tapi kalau sekarang udah ada alatnya lebih canggih gitu untuk menangkap satu note itu gitu. Jadi ini hanya alat ukur aja, bukan digeneralisasi, tapi hidupnya sih tetap masing-masing gitu. Yang tradisi tetap hidup tradisi, yang ini tetap gitu. Jadi nggak usah terlalu geosentris katanya gitu. Okay, it's Adhan Asar already. It's the mark of us to end these sessions. Thank you very much for your delivery, and thank you for all the attendance, and we may meet again in another studium general that held by the faculty. Thank you very much. Give applause to Professor Klaus. Okay, there's another section that we will give you a certificate. This is the certificate that from the faculty as thank you notes to Professor Klaus. Give applause. Oh, yeah. Next sessions we'll be taking pictures with the audience. So all audience.